The sound of a dry erase marker hitting a whiteboard has a very specific, aggressive quality when the person writing is fueled by a volatile cocktail of massive urgency and absolute certainty. It's not the slow, deliberate stroke of a guy calmly presenting a PowerPoint, but the frantic, violent scratching of someone desperately trying to rip a brilliant idea out of their head and force it into the real world before the window slams shut. The entire team of elite engineers was dead silent. It wasn't that polite corporate silence where everyone is just waiting for their turn to talk. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room full of apex predators who had just been violently ambushed by a variable that wasn't on the agenda, wasn't in their million-dollar software models, and absolutely shattered their arrogant expectations of what that room was capable of producing today. There were bespoke Italian suits and security badges practically dripping with Ivy League acronyms, and every single one of those suits and badges was locked onto the whiteboard with the terrifying expression of an expert who recognizes undeniable genius the second they see it, even before their brain can fully process the math. The man standing with his back to the room was wearing heavy canvas coveralls, permanently stained with the shrapnel of hard labor. Cured concrete caked into the knee joints, white drywall dust ground into the left shoulder. The brutal colors of the construction site physically baked into the fabric because some stains just don't wash out. No matter how many times you run the cycle, the calloused hand gripping the marker was shaking with the intense physical effort of a man desperately trying to control a stutter that constantly fought him. But the equations he was violently slashing across the board were rock solid, driven by the ironclad certainty of a master who knows his math is bulletproof, regardless of how badly his hands shake. His voice broke through the silence in jagged, agonizing bursts, not the hesitant pauses of a guy who doesn't know what he's talking about, but the brutal, exhausting pauses of a severe stutter. It was the sound of a man literally going to war with his own vocal cords just to drag a fully formed, genius-level thought out of his brain and into the air. The resonance frequency is locked at 0.47 hertz. You just need to neutralize it with active cross-bracing. The chief engineer had dropped her own marker without even realizing her fingers had gone slack. She was staring dead at the whiteboard with the shattered expression of a woman verifying an impossible equation that absolutely had no business existing in that room, written by a pair of dirty hands that had no business holding the pen. Her voice barely registered as a whisper before it actually formed words. That is mathematically impossible. Nobody in this room had access to that telemetry. But to fully grasp how a guy wearing concrete-stained coveralls ended up hijacking the whiteboard in a multi-million-dollar corporate war room, you have to rewind to where the real story actually starts. In the pitch black before the sun comes up, shoved into a packed city bus, wrapped in the suffocating silence of a man who learned how to play invisible, because being seen always carried a price tag he couldn't afford to pay. John Mendez woke up when the city was still trapped in that dead, frozen state right before dawn. That brutal hour when the dark is just starting to crack, but hasn't fully surrendered yet. A time zone that blue-collar ghosts know intimately, while the corporate suits are still deep in REM sleep. His rented room in a rundown boarding house was exactly what it was, with zero pretensions. Walls so paper-thin he could smell his neighbor's cheap coffee before his own pot even boiled. And a rusty showerhead that offered exactly 2 settings, freezing and absolute zero. Over the years, he had aggressively optimized his morning protocol into a ruthless tactical operation, every single motion bleeding flawlessly into the next, because the city bus didn't give a damn about excuses, and the job site clock started ticking before the sun broke the horizon. If you walked through the gates late, you were dead to the foreman, period. The notebook was sitting dead center on the small laminate table. There had always been a battered notebook on his table ever since John learned how to hold a pencil. Ever since his old man had shoved the first one into his hands with the gruff intensity of a guy handing over a loaded weapon, unable to fully explain why his son was going to need it to survive. His dad had been a master site superintendent, not the clipboard warrior kind who manages logistics from an AC-chilled trailer, but the gritty analog kind who knew how to physically execute every single order he barked. A man who had absorbed the brutal physics of deep foundations, structural loads, and sheer stress limits directly into his bones long before he ever cracked a textbook. And he had passed that lethal street-level engineering down to his son, the only way that kind of knowledge transfers, through years of shared silence and absolute attention in the dirt. The current notebook was bound in heavy leather, violently scarred from riding in the chest pocket of his coveralls for months, absorbing the toxic cocktail of concrete dust, sweat, blistering sun, and freezing rain, surviving only because John meticulously wrapped it in a plastic sleeve that he swapped out whenever the elements chewed through it. Inside those wrinkled pages were calculations that absolutely did not belong in a grunt's pocket. They were the highly advanced theoretical equations of a man who had reverse-engineered the entire language of structural mechanics, learning obliquely from his father, and heavily supplemented by decades of hunting down discarded university textbooks in dusty used bookstores, absorbing the high-level data that the academic world had thrown away. And on certain specific pages, you could see the heavy, aggressive indentations where the pencil lead had nearly punched through the paper, the exact coordinates of absolute certainty, where the math had locked in flawlessly on the first strike and never required a single erasure. The stutter had been an aggressive, inescapable parasite since he was a kid, carrying the stubborn persistence of a massive glitch that doesn't have a patch, eventually mutating into a core structural pillar of his entire existence. It wasn't just a minor annoyance, it was a heavy, suffocating dimension that dictated exactly how John navigated the world, aggressively teaching him the brutal economy of words. It forged in him a terrifying, hyper-vigilant attention to silence, a superpower that arrogant people who love to hear themselves talk rarely develop, because they never have to fight for airspace. He learned early on that opening his mouth cost him infinitely more energy and humiliation than a normal guy. So he aggressively conserved his ammunition, only firing off words when silence was no longer a tactical option. The cable-stayed bridge project was the most massive, high-stakes war zone he had ever stepped foot on. It was the kind of billion-dollar, legacy-defining infrastructure beast that dominates the front pages of industry magazines, boasting a massive brass plaque with politicians' names etched into it before the concrete even cures. The bridge was engineered to violently span a massive river valley, where the brutal geography demanded terrifyingly long, unsupported central spans. The elite architectural solution was a cable-stayed design. Those massive, hyper-aggressive towers that look like modern art but function as pure, raw physics, suspending the massive highway deck entirely by high-tension steel cables, transforming raw engineering into a visible, terrifying flex of human dominance over gravity. John had walked onto the site as a baseline grunt, the absolute bottom of the food chain, the guy who hauls the rebar, mixes the sludge, wrestles the heavy wooden forms into the mud, and executes the brutal, invisible physical labor that has to happen before the suits can even boot up their laptops. He carried the heavy iron, he poured the concrete, and he executed every single order with the dead quiet, lethal competence of a ghost who had been trained by the universe to be absolutely flawless at the micro-tasks, because the micro-tasks are the only things keeping the macro-structure from collapsing. And he watched everything. He visually dissected the massive steel suspension cables, with the terrifying focus of a man holding a notebook full of equations that transformed his raw observation into lethal data. He wasn't just looking at the bridge. He was actively processing the physical reality against the advanced theoretical physics locked in his head, synthesizing the two into a massive, undeniable truth. Dr. Renata Cavalcante had rolled onto the massive site on day one, in a sleek, blacked-out luxury SUV that aggressively broadcasted her alpha-tier status before her boots even hit the gravel. She stepped out wearing a pristine, blindingly white hard hat and a high-end safety vest that looked immaculate, simply because she never actually stayed in the trenches long enough for the dirt to stick. Her PhD had been minted at an elite European university, a fact she aggressively weaponized at every available opportunity, carrying herself with that specific, toxic arrogance of an executive who relies entirely on institutional validation to fuel her massive ego. She was highly competent. It is critical to state that fact because her brilliance was undeniable. Her structural calculus was flawless, her finite element analysis was state-of-the-art, and her mastery over the multi-million-dollar simulation software was absolute. Her technical competence wasn't the problem. The catastrophic glitch was what that competence had mutated into. The arrogant, psychotic delusion that her formal digital data was the only valid source of truth on the planet, and that any analog blue-collar field experience was just uneducated garbage that needed to be aggressively ignored. During a massive logistical briefing in week 2, a grizzled veteran site superintendent respectfully raised a massive red flag regarding the soil's shear strength near a critical piling sector. He based his warning on 3 decades of bleeding in that exact regional clay, calmly noting that he had witnessed catastrophic subterranean shifts on a neighboring site that the shiny corporate 3D models almost always failed to predict because the software didn't account for hyper-local micro-faults. Dr. Renata had listened with the toxic, condescending patience of an apex predator, just waiting for the prey to finish talking so she could execute it with a preloaded kill shot. She coldly stated, projecting her voice so the entire trailer heard it, that elite structural engineering is built on hard, verifiable mathematics, not backwoods, superstitious guesswork. She delivered the brutal teardown with the slick, sterilized tone of a professor correcting a slow child, entirely convinced she was doing him a favor, oblivious to the public castration she just administered. The veteran superintendent just clamped his jaw shut and stared dead at his boots, while the rest of the corporate suits immediately moved on to the next slide like the execution hadn't even happened. John had been standing just outside the trailer, hauling heavy boxes of core samples, locked in the invisible position of the ghost who isn't invited to the table but catches all the intel bleeding through the cracked door. He absorbed Renata's arrogant dismissal with the cold, calculating focus of an operator, processing not just the data, but the catastrophic flaw in the commander's logic. He kept hauling the heavy boxes, and when he finally grabbed a 2-minute window in the shadows, he ripped out his notebook and aggressively logged the data. The harmonic vibrations started as a microscopic, almost imperceptible flutter that 99% of the crew would never have flagged as a lethal threat. It was a subtle, erratic shudder that pulsed through the steel when a specific external variable, in this case a highly localized, high-velocity crosswind, slammed into the structure. The million-dollar software had technically predicted a wind load interaction, but the algorithm had catastrophically miscalculated the environmental feedback loop because one microscopic data point in the initial code was slightly off-center. John caught the glitch in week 3. He felt it because he was humping gear high up on the scaffolding, right next to the massive primary suspension cables, on a day when the crosswinds were howling. Before his eyes even registered the movement, his boots felt the heavy, terrifying vibration bleeding out of the steel and pulsing into the temporary deck. A very specific, rhythmic oscillation that wasn't the chaotic, random shaking of wind shear. It was the terrifying, ordered, rhythmic pulse of a structural, natural frequency, being aggressively excited by an external force that was hitting way too close to the critical threshold to ignore. He froze dead on the scaffolding, his calloused hand locked onto the vibrating steel cable. He closed his eyes. He counted the rhythm. He cracked open the leather notebook that night in his freezing, cramped room, ignoring the pathetic sound of his neighbor's shower, and went to war with the math. He deployed the brutal equations his father had drilled into his skull, aggressively cross-referencing them against the advanced dynamic load formulas he had memorized from the discarded university textbooks, his pages already bleeding with heavy pencil marks from the questions the bridge had forced him to ask before the suits even realized there was a problem. He locked in the target coordinate, 0.47 Hertz. It was the exact lethal resonance frequency of those specific suspension cables, under those exact tension loads, fighting that specific atmospheric pressure and crosswind velocity. It was a massive, catastrophic number that absolutely did not exist in the official corporate blueprint, because the shiny 3D model had simulated a slightly different environmental wind shear profile. And that microscopic gap between the sanitized simulation and the brutal reality of the river valley had created a discrepancy that looked like a rounding error on a spreadsheet, but was an absolute death sentence in the real world. Because harmonic resonance does not scale linearly, it multiplies violently. The next morning he cornered the sector foreman. He stood there clutching the open notebook in his calloused hand, pointing a filthy finger at the raw math. He fought a brutal, agonizing war against his own vocal cords, stuttering through the explanation, desperately trying to warn the foreman that the crosswinds were continuously hammering the suspension cables at the exact same lethal frequency, like a guy pushing a kid on a swing at the exact right millisecond, stacking the kinetic energy until the swing violently flips over the bar. The foreman just waved him off with a grunt and walked away. John stood dead still in the mud, holding his notebook, staring at the back of the foreman's high-vis vest. He slowly turned his head to look at the massive steel cables vibrating in the afternoon wind, and he quietly tucked the leather notebook back into his chest pocket with the grim, cold certainty of a man hoarding ammunition for a war he knows is coming. The crosswinds that afternoon were the most violent they had seen all week. The harmonic oscillations aggressively mutated over the next 7 days, following the terrifying, inescapable physics of a catastrophic failure that is being actively ignored. It wasn't a sudden, explosive cinematic collapse. It was the silent, relentless mathematical progression of kinetic energy stacking up, completely indifferent to whether the corporate suits found it convenient or not. Doctor? Renata triggered a massive code-red emergency summit in the primary executive war room. A sterile, over-air-conditioned glass box dominated by a massive 4K projector, the exact kind of bunker where arrogant people make billion-dollar decisions based on flawed data. 6 elite structural engineers with Ivy League master's degrees flanked the mahogany table, their high-end laptops running the absolute bleeding-edge finite element analysis simulators. They hammered the digital models. The software was undeniably brilliant, processing millions of variables simultaneously, spitting out structural load capacities down to 4 decimal points of precision. But a simulation is only as lethal as the intel you feed it, and the old computer science law is absolute. Garbage in, garbage out. The elite team hit a massive, unexplainable dead end. The digital results completely failed to sync with the terrifying physical oscillations they were finally observing on the actual cables. It was a massive, glaring gap between the sanitized theory and the violent reality, and the million-dollar software was completely blind to the cause. One of the sharpest junior analysts cautiously raised a red flag. He spoke up with the hyper-careful, guarded tone of a guy who knows he's navigating a political minefield, quietly suggesting they needed to run a deep-dive diagnostic on the natural frequency of the specific cables in that exact span. He theorized there was a highly probable, lethal feedback loop happening between the external wind shear excitation and the cable's internal harmonic resonance, a chaotic variable that the sterilized default models frequently overlooked when the environmental topography was hyper-specific. It was a brilliant, surgically precise hypothesis. It was, in fact, the exact right answer. Doctor. Renata absorbed the intel with the toxic, calculating stare of an executive deciding whether to steal an idea or crush it, and coldly declared that the real issue was simply a lack of granular, high-res telemetry data feeding the system. She mandated they deploy more sensors and rerun the exact same simulations with slightly tweaked input parameters. It was the classic, arrogant reflex of a zealot who worships the algorithm, blaming the physical world for failing to provide perfect data, rather than admitting her million-dollar god had a blind spot. The junior analyst quietly closed his laptop, immediately surrendering the fight. John was standing right outside the glass door, holding a tray of lukewarm coffee. He had rolled up exactly as the heavy door drifted open. The last suit to enter hadn't pushed it until it clicked, and John froze in the hallway for a critical 10 seconds before stepping into the crossfire. His ears locked onto the exact terminology he had brutally calculated in his notebook weeks ago. He heard the junior analyst say, "Natural frequency," with the ringing clarity of a sniper confirming a target ID. He breached the room, ghosting around the mahogany table pouring coffee with the total, learned invisibility of a man who knows how to occupy a space without triggering a threat response. He quietly gathered the empty mugs, keeping his back to the executive firing squad. And in a 2-second window of pure calculated stealth, he slipped his notebook out of his chest pocket and aggressively logged the fake corrupted frequency number they were projecting on the 4K screen. He stared at the data point that was mathematically wrong, a number that sat just far enough off his own brutal calculations to look like a minor glitch, but was actually sitting on the wrong side of the lethal resonance threshold, meaning their fix was going to be completely useless. He shoved the notebook back into his pocket and ghosted out the door with the tray. A heavy-hitting European consulting engineer was flown in 7 days later on a direct corporate jet, burning a massive consulting fee that could have funded the safety budget for 3 entire projects. He rolled into the war room wielding a resume that was essentially a blunt force weapon. 26 years executing massive cable-stayed infrastructure across 4 continents, his name plastered across elite engineering journals, radiating the kind of untouchable authority that forces arrogant suits to shut up and listen before he even boots up his PowerPoint. He ran a highly aggressive 2-day forensic sweep. He pitched his master solution via a slick, hyper-detailed presentation, speaking with the effortless, dead-calm swagger of an apex predator who is permanently the smartest guy in the room. He mandated the immediate installation of massive tuned mass dampers, gigantic, incredibly heavy, astronomically expensive counterweights that would be bolted directly into the primary towers to violently absorb and scatter the kinetic vibration before it could hit critical mass in the cables. It was a brilliant, proven engineering tactic. It had successfully saved dozens of massive bridges in totally different environments, fighting totally different wind shear profiles, where the core problem matched the data he was currently looking at. The catastrophic, fatal flaw was that it absolutely would not stop the specific, lethal resonance actively destroying this bridge, because the expert had engineered his multi-million-dollar countermeasure using the corrupted data from Renata's flawed software model. The massive dampers were being mathematically tuned to fight the wrong frequency. They were going to deploy heavy artillery to shoot at a ghost. But in that boardroom, the actual physical reality didn't matter. What mattered was that a highly credentialed savior had handed them a shiny, expensive band-aid, and Dr. Renata desperately needed to throw a lifeline to her panicked investors to keep the funding from evaporating. She signed off on the strike instantly. She pulled the trigger with the desperate relief of an executive thrilled to have a scapegoat if things went sideways, aggressively pushing the narrative up the corporate ladder. She pitched the multi-million-dollar dampers and the massive schedule delay as an unavoidable, heroic intervention that would permanently secure the asset. The brutal financial hit and the blown timeline were carefully sanitized and spoon-fed to the billionaires. The investors were furious about the bleeding ledger, but they aggressively greenlit the purchase orders because Renata sold them the lie that the only alternative was permanently halting the build, a total collapse of the project that would cost them infinitely more than buying the heavy iron. A massive all-hands crisis summit was triggered for the following week. The room was packed with heavy hitters, the billionaire investors, the ruthless government oversight liaisons, and a pack of elite infrastructure journalists who were hovering like vultures because the project was massive enough that a catastrophic failure would make international headlines. It was the kind of high-stakes war council where every single syllable is permanently logged, not just in the official minutes, but burned into the memories of ruthless operators who use that intel to destroy careers later. John had been ordered to hump the heavy AV gear into the boardroom. It was a standard grunt work detail, handed down by a logistics manager who didn't even look at John's face when he barked the order. He had hauled the heavy Pelican cases in an hour before the suits arrived, strictly ordered to wire the mics, boot the projectors, and get the hell out before the VIPs showed up. He was efficiently locking down the XLR cables with the silent, rapid competence of a guy who has executed 1,000 invisible tasks flawlessly. He was locking in the final feed when his eyes caught the massive whiteboard at the front of the room. Someone had already pre-written the core telemetry for the presentation, the software's corrupted output data, the heavy specs for the European dampers, and the completely fake natural frequency they were targeting. He froze dead in his tracks. The number on the board was a total lie. It directly contradicted the brutal math bleeding through the pages of his notebook. It wasn't off by a massive cartoonish margin. It was the exact kind of microscopic, insidious error that lazy software absorbs and smooths out in a standard sensitivity analysis. But in the brutal, unforgiving physics of harmonic resonance, that tiny margin of error meant they were standing on the wrong side of the blast door. John stood paralyzed, staring at the whiteboard, losing total track of time as the high-end suits started flooding into the room. The billionaires claimed their leather chairs, the government liaisons opened their laptops, and the summit officially kicked off around him with the terrifying inevitability of a massive machine powering up. When Dr. Renata finally clicked to the master slide detailing the multi-million-dollar damper deployment and flashed the fake frequency on the 4K screen, the heavy, agonizing decision John had been fighting in his gut for weeks violently crystallized into an absolute imperative. He had to pull the pin. He raised his hand. It was a small, hesitant gesture from the back shadows, and he had to aggressively lock his shoulder and force it higher before anyone even registered the movement. When they finally spotted him, the room reacted with the stunned, confused silence of people staring at a glitch in the matrix. A guy covered in concrete dust, standing in the back of a billionaire's war room, raising his hand like a terrified kid in a lecture hall. Dr. Baus. Renata snapped her head toward him, her face instantly recalibrating as she aggressively identified the threat, trying to process who the hell had breached her perimeter. John started to speak. He led the charge with a massive, agonizing physical effort, his jaw locking as he fought the brutal stutter. He didn't pause because he was confused. He paused because he was literally at war with his own throat, desperately forcing out the words that the frequency on the board was a catastrophic lie, that he had manually calculated the true resonance threshold of the specific suspension cables, and that her million-dollar solution was targeting a ghost. Dr. Renata launched out of her leather chair. She marched straight down the center aisle toward him, with the terrifying, aggressive momentum of an apex predator, moving in for a public execution, not walking to listen, but marching to annihilate. She projected her voice to make absolutely sure every single journalist and billionaire in the room heard the kill shot, flashing a toxic, razor-thin smile that was infinitely more vicious than a screaming fit because it masqueraded as polite amusement while it gutted him. "Are you honestly attempting to lecture me on advanced structural dynamics?" She let a heavy, suffocating beat of silence hang in the air, allowing the sheer, arrogant absurdity of her question to paralyze the room. A filthy laborer who can barely string together a coherent sentence? The silence that hijacked the room was the sickening, cowardly quiet of 30 powerful people watching a brutal massacre and having absolutely zero idea how to intervene, or lacking the spine to try. She pointed a manicured finger violently at the exit. "This is a classified briefing for elite specialists. You are dismissed." Her voice plunged into a freezing, dead calm register that is infinitely worse than hot rage, because rage burns out, but ice leaves permanent frostbite. "And if you ever set foot in this executive wing again, I will have you arrested. Get back in the mud and do the only thing you're actually qualified for, hauling bricks." John slowly lowered his head. He picked his battered notebook up off the empty chair next to him, slid it back into the chest pocket of his coveralls with the exact same meticulous care he always used, and started the long, agonizing walk to the door. He moved through the dead silence, flanked by the pathetic, muffled snickers of a few cowardly suits, the kind of suppressed, toxic laughter that is always infinitely more devastating than an open insult, because it demands the victim acknowledge the humiliation, while cowardice hides the attacker. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. Out in the sterile, fluorescent hallway, which was completely abandoned because everyone was inside watching the execution, John stopped dead. He pressed his calloused hand flat against the drywall, staring down at his boots, his face locked in the agonizing, silent grimace of a man absorbing a massive, invisible shrapnel wound to the chest. It is genuinely sickening to believe that an educated professional could weaponize a man's stutter in front of a room full of VIPs, aggressively twisting a physical disability into fake proof that his brilliant mind was worthless, arrogantly assuming that a man's intelligence is dictated by how smoothly he can speak. If that level of toxic elitist bullying makes your blood boil, if you are 100% standing in the hallway with John right now, smash that like button. That tap is your way of screaming that what happened in that boardroom was a massacre, and that someone on the other side of this screen is actually listening. Back inside the glass box, the corporate machine kept grinding. The multi-million-dollar dampers, aggressively calibrated to fight the wrong ghost, were rubber-stamped by a room full of cowards who lacked the technical spine to question the algorithm, blindly trusting the shiny presentation over physical reality. And John stood alone in the hallway, the heavy notebook burning a hole in his chest, holding the absolute truth in his pocket. He was just waiting for the timer to hit 0, because the raw laws of physics do not give a damn about who got humiliated in a boardroom. And the lethal resonance frequency he had calculated in the dirt was exactly what it was, regardless of whether the suits gave him permission to say it out loud. John finally pushed himself off the drywall and started walking down the long corridor, moving with the heavy, aimless momentum of a guy who needs to keep his boots moving, because stopping would let the humiliation completely shatter him. He walked back out onto the massive, chaotic job site, instantly swallowed by the aggressive indifference of a billion-dollar machine. Heavy iron was roaring in every sector. Foremen were screaming over radios, and the relentless grinding momentum of construction ignored the fact that 2 human beings had just engaged in a psychological bloodbath behind closed doors. He navigated the labyrinth of scaffolding and poured concrete, his heavy shoulders absorbing the specific, toxic weight of a highly public execution. A private insult fades, but a public massacre leaves witnesses, and those witnesses burn the humiliation into your psyche with a persistence that time never really washes out. He hit the perimeter of the primary span, where the massive, skeletal towers launched into the sky, gripping the high-tension cables that vanished into the clouds like steel spiderwebs. It was a terrifying, beautiful flex of raw engineering, a beast that had consumed years of logistics, and would eventually carry millions of oblivious commuters who would never know the names of the grunts who bled into the concrete. And right on cue, the valley crosswinds started howling. Not the chaotic, random gusts that snap flags, but the heavy, sustained, unidirectional wind shear that the topography of that specific river valley aggressively funneled straight into the bridge. The exact environmental trigger John had been mathematically tracking in his notebook for a month. The massive steel cables started to hum. John froze dead in the mud, staring up at the steel with eyes that had completely shed the hollow stare of a humiliated grunt. He was looking at the bridge with the terrifying, laser-guided focus of a master operator reading matrix code, and what he saw was a catastrophic escalation. The harmonic flutter was aggressively mutating, rapidly approaching the critical threshold where the kinetic energy stops scaling linearly and goes fully exponential. Every single wind strike was violently feeding the next oscillation, stacking the energy into a massive, unstoppable feedback loop that the structure could not dissipate on its own. His old man's voice suddenly cut through the roaring wind, hitting his brain with the crystal-clear intensity of a memory that isn't just an image, but a physical shockwave. He couldn't see his dad's face, but he felt the heavy, undeniable presence, remembering the exact tone of a quiet night in the garage when the old man would lay his scarred hands on a busted engine and just think out loud, not lecturing, just downloading genius into the kid sitting next to him. The iron doesn't give a damn about a shiny diploma, kid. It only listens to the guy who speaks its language. That sentence, buried in his subconscious for decades, violently detonated in his mind right then. The humiliating massacre in the boardroom hadn't crushed the truth. It had paradoxically burned all the noise away, leaving only the absolute, undeniable weight of what he knew. His posture fundamentally shifted. It wasn't a sudden, cinematic, chest-puffing pose. It was a microscopic internal realignment. The terrifying dead calm shift that happens when massive humiliation collides with absolute certainty. And the certainty wins. Not because it's louder, but because it's anchored to a truth that arrogant insults cannot penetrate. Raw, undeniable physics. John reached deep into the cargo pocket of his coveralls, his fingers wrapped around the dry erase marker. He had started carrying it weeks ago. A cheap blue pen with a cracked cap, used for furiously scratching quick math onto drywall and plywood when his notebook wasn't fast enough. It had just enough ink left to execute a kill shot. He locked his eyes on the rear service entrance of the primary executive trailer. It was the ghost door, the secondary hatch used by the catering crew and the maintenance grunts to haul trash and coffee without polluting the pristine main lobby where the VIPs roamed. He had mentally mapped the exact route during his coffee runs, internalizing the stealth topography that the invisible working class masters, because they have to navigate the war zone without triggering the perimeter alarms. He breached the door. The rear corridor was completely dead, carrying that heavy, pressurized vacuum that surrounds a war room when a billion-dollar decision is being finalized. The security detail and the sycophants were all hovering out front, arrogantly assuming the back door was secure, because the only guy who used it had just been publicly executed and banished to the mud. John hit the rear door of the boardroom. Inside, Dr. Renata was wrapping up her victory lap, smoothly deploying the final budgetary slides that justified the multi-million-dollar dampers. She was aggressively spinning the narrative, making the catastrophic delay and the massive price tag look like a brilliant, unavoidable tactical pivot, having already suffocated any alternative theories before they could even breathe. John shoved the heavy oak door open. He stepped into the crossfire. Invading a locked-down executive summit after being publicly banished required a terrifying, specific breed of courage. Not the loud, aggressive swagger of a guy looking for a fistfight, but the icy, unstoppable momentum of a man who knows that the truth he is holding is infinitely more important than the social humiliation of speaking it. He was stepping into the blast radius because the collateral damage of staying silent was a catastrophe he refused to let happen. He marched straight for the massive whiteboard. The private security contractor posted by the door reacted instantly, his hand dropping to his belt, moving to intercept with the rapid, aggressive training of a guy paid to neutralize a threat moving on the VIPs. But right before the guard could put hands on him, a voice cut through the room from the far flank of the mahogany table. It was an older, grizzled structural engineer, a guy with snow-white hair, who had been sitting quietly in the back corner, his face locked in a permanent, unhappy grimace as the corporate presentation had dragged on. He hadn't said a word all morning, but he raised his hand now with a simple, heavy gesture that commanded absolute authority, not because of his corporate title, but because he carried the raw gravity of a silverback who had actually built things. "Hold!" He barked the order at the guard, his tone absolute. "Let the man finish." The security contractor froze dead, the entire boardroom flatlined, plunging into the terrifying, breathless silence of a room full of apex predators, watching a script violently burn to the ground. Dr. Renata stood paralyzed at the podium, her eyes darting frantically, her brain totally short-circuiting, as she tried to calculate a corporate response to an impossible variable. John hit the whiteboard. He violently yanked the cracked cap off the marker. It wasn't a theatrical flourish. It was the aggressive, desperate motion of a man who absolutely had to bleed the math out of his skull and burn it onto the wall so the experts could finally see the truth. He started writing. The equations exploded out of the marker with the terrifying fluid speed of a genius downloading a completed matrix directly from his brain. Zero hesitation. No pausing to remember a textbook formula. It was the aggressive, flawless transcription of raw physics that he knew as intimately as his own heartbeat. He hammered out the advanced harmonic vibration formulas for high-tension cables, aggressively locking in the hyper-specific parameters of that exact suspension span, plugging in the brutal environmental variables he had hoarded from the discarded technical specs lying around the site. And dead center on the board, massive and undeniable, he boxed the kill shot. 0.47 hertz. He slowly turned to face the firing squad. When he spoke, the brutal stutter was still there. The agonizing physical war with his own throat hadn't vanished, but the frequency of his voice had fundamentally mutated. The terrified hesitation from his first attempt was completely gone. It was replaced by the terrifying, ironclad authority of a man who isn't begging for permission to speak, but is declaring a scientific fact that will violently collapse the building if ignored. The bridge. He fought through the block. It wants to swing at this exact rhythm. It's her actual voice. He stabbed the whiteboard with the marker, pointing dead at the number. The $1 million dampers are just burning cash. The only way to kill it. Another brutal pause, shorter this time, his sheer willpower overpowering the glitch, is to manually adjust the tension on the primary cables by exactly 2%, in a highly specific asymmetrical sequence. He locked eyes with the Ivy League engineers, the panicked billionaires, and finally Dr. Renata, who was standing frozen, her face mutating from arrogant fury into sheer, unadulterated terror as her eyes rapidly scanned the hyper-advanced math on the board. She was involuntarily reading the equations because her brain couldn't stop processing data that was undeniably brilliant. It's exactly like tuning a heavy guitar string. The war room was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. The grizzled older engineer slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back and stood up. He walked down the center aisle, sliding his reading glasses back onto his face, and stopped 3 feet from the whiteboard. He stared at the sprawling matrix of equations with the intense hypercritical focus of a master auditor, verifying a flight path, checking the math against a lifetime of hard iron experience. He stood there in absolute silence for a full, agonizing minute, letting the unbearable tension slowly strangle the room, making damn sure everyone knew he was treating the grunt's math with absolute reverence. He finally turned his head to look at Dr. Renata, his face locked in the heavy, disappointed expression of a veteran who has just confirmed a catastrophic failure. He prayed wasn't true, but has to call out because the math never lies. He stated, his voice dropping into a low, devastating rumble that echoed across the silent room, that the grunt's number was flawlessly accurate. Dr. Renata physically recoiled, then aggressively launched herself forward, her corporate survival instincts violently hijacking her brain. It was the frantic automatic reflex of an arrogant executive who has learned that the only way to survive a public execution is to aggressively scream louder than the truth and violently reassert dominance before the doubt spreads. She started rapid-firing a pathetic, nervous laugh, the toxic, defensive mutation of her usual arrogant sneer, sounding incredibly brittle and desperate, generated by pure panic because freezing in silence was a death sentence. This is absolute unhinged garbage. These scribbles are completely... She lunged toward the whiteboard, snatching a marker from the tray, fully intending to violently scrub the board clean and aggressively overwrite the math with her sanitized corporate lies, and she froze dead. Her eyes locked onto the core formula anchoring the entire matrix, not the baseline harmonic equation any sophomore engineering student could recite, but the hyper-advanced, totally original theorem John had deployed to bridge the variables. It was a completely rogue calculation that seamlessly integrated a chaotic environmental variable that the $1 million software intentionally ignored, because programming it required a specific, genius-level approach that had only been theorized by one specific mind in one highly obscure academic paper, a paper that had briefly circulated in the elite underground before being aggressively buried, simply because it didn't come with the right corporate sponsorships. She had seen that exact equation before, once during a grueling late-night research binge for her PhD dissertation, hunting for an obscure citation. She had skimmed the paper with the arrogant, half-assed attention of a student looking for a quick quote, and she had instantly tossed it in the trash because the author wasn't published in the shiny international journals. The paper wasn't translated into elite academic English, and the sheer brutal complexity of the math demanded a level of focus she arrogantly refused to invest. The insult died in her throat. She stood paralyzed inches from the whiteboard, her marker hovering uselessly in the air, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the ghost of a genius she thought she had buried. The voice that shattered the silence wasn't hers. The older, grizzled engineer had slowly turned to face the room. He moved with the heavy, deliberate momentum of a man who has been holding a live grenade for an hour, and has finally decided to pull the pin, knowing the explosion is going to be messy, but absolutely necessary. He didn't waste time on a long introduction. He just dropped his credentials with the terrifying brevity of a guy who knows his name is a heavyweight stamp. He stated his name, casually mentioned the 32 years he spent as the chair of advanced structural analytics at the top federal university, and explicitly confirmed that dynamic resonance was his exact, hyper-specialized field of expertise. He locked eyes with Dr. Renata, and the look he hit her with wasn't hot rage or petty vengeance. It was the profound, crushing disappointment of a master looking at a student who has catastrophically failed the only test that actually matters. Dr. Cavalcante, I understand you secured your doctorate at MIT. He dropped the credential not as a compliment, but as a heavy iron weapon. But it appears you catastrophically failed to study the actual history of structural engineering in this country. He let the silence hang for a brutal second, twisting the knife. The math on that board is the proprietary work of Professor Antonio Mendez. His voice dropped into that low, reverent register reserved strictly for legends who died in the trenches. He was the absolute greatest genius in dynamic structural resonance this hemisphere has ever seen. He bled for 20 years to forge that methodology, and he aggressively published his findings locally because he refused to sell out to the international journals before his own people had access to it. A longer, heavier pause. He died 5 years ago, broke, ghosted by the elite institutions and completely erased by arrogant academics in rooms exactly like this one. He slowly turned and pointed a finger dead at John. This filthy laborer that you just publicly massacred in front of this entire board, the man you ordered to go haul bricks when he was desperately trying to save your multi-million-dollar project. The veteran engineer's voice didn't rise a single decibel, but it commanded the room with absolute, terrifying authority. Is his son. He inherited the underground library. He inherited the raw, unpublished data that you arrogantly refused to read. He stared hard at the whiteboard. And he inherited the raw, uncut genius. The kind of genius that a shiny piece of paper from MIT can never, ever buy, and the lack of a diploma can never, ever erase. The boardroom flatlined into the kind of terrifying, absolute zero silence that only happens when a massive, unkillable truth is detonated in public. Dr. Renata was the color of wet ash. The blood drained from her face in slow, agonizing waves as the catastrophic reality of her total destruction set in. Her entire ego, her elite career, her identity had been aggressively built on the toxic foundation of institutional arrogance, worshipping Ivy League degrees, chasing publications in the right journals, and blindly trusting the sanitized echo chamber of elite academia. And standing right in front of her was a dirty whiteboard, covered in flawless, god-tier mathematics, written by a shaking, calloused hand. A man she had treated like garbage had just effortlessly executed a hyper-complex calculation that she, a team of 6 PhDs, a $1 million software suite, and an elite European consultant, had totally failed to crack. He had saved the bridge using a battered pocket notebook. The massive, undeniable illusion she had built her entire life on was violently imploding. The toxic delusion that brilliance only exists in corner offices, and that blue-collar hands are incapable of genius, was shattered permanently. She slowly turned her head to look at John. John looked right back at her. There was absolutely zero arrogant flexing in his eyes, no smug smirk, no cinematic victory lap. What was burning in his eyes was something infinitely heavier and much harder for her to survive. The absolute, immovable peace of a man who had held the line and told the truth. In that dead calm stare, she saw the ghost of the father who had taught him the math in the dark. She saw the battered notebook that had survived the mud, and she saw the absolute, undeniable perfection of ESO 47 Hertz. And buried deep in the background underneath the suffocating silence of the boardroom. You could almost hear the massive steel cables outside howling in the wind, vibrating at the exact lethal frequency John had diagnosed, waiting for someone to finally listen. The multi-million-dollar cables hadn't magically stopped vibrating just because an arrogant executive threw a tantrum. The bridge had kept screaming its true voice into the wind, waiting for the one guy who actually spoke its language. The crisis summit was violently derailed. It wasn't officially adjourned, it just shattered. The formal agenda completely incinerated by the massive reality check that had just detonated in the room. The apex billionaire investor pushed his heavy leather chair back and stood up. He didn't say a word, just stared dead at the whiteboard for a long, heavy minute, burning the equations into his brain, not trying to verify the math he didn't understand, but aggressively archiving the moment. Recognizing he was looking at the exact reason his investment was about to be saved, and the exact reason he was about to execute the woman who almost destroyed it. He slowly turned his head and locked eyes with John. There was no polite corporate throat clearing, just the ruthless, terrifying efficiency of an apex predator who just realized his billion-dollar asset was vibrating itself to pieces, and the only guy holding the kill switch had been ordered to leave the room 5 minutes ago. He pointed a finger at John and ordered him to brief the room on the full tactical solution. And then, the entire gravitational pull of the room violently flipped. It was one of those rare, brutal paradigm shifts that doesn't require a screaming match. The center of power effortlessly ripped away from the podium and slammed down in the back of the room, the universe aggressively correcting itself as reality finally slaughtered the corporate illusion. John stood tall, dead center in the billionaire's war room. He was still wearing the filthy, concrete-stained coveralls. The brutal stutter was still fighting him on every syllable, the agonizing pauses still warring with his throat. But he pulled the battered, sweat-stained leather notebook out of his chest pocket, flipping it open to the hyper-dense, aggressive calculations he had written in the dark, completely unfazed by the suit staring at him. The grizzled veteran engineer grabbed a heavy legal pad, abandoned his chair, and posted up right next to John. He didn't hover like a patronizing boss. He stood shoulder to shoulder like a trench brother, instantly recognizing his role as the tactical translator. The guy who was going to take the raw, uncut genius bleeding out of John's notebook and format it into the sanitized corporate specs the system needed to execute the strike. John launched the briefing. He broke down the catastrophic failure with the terrifying, razor-sharp simplicity of a master who has fought his way through the deepest complexity and come out the other side holding the pure truth. He explained that the massive structure had a natural dormant heartbeat, a resting frequency it inherently wanted to vibrate at. The aggressive crosswinds were hammering the bridge at a frequency dangerously close to that heartbeat, creating a lethal feedback loop. And he dropped the hammer. The fix wasn't bolting millions of dollars of dead weight to the towers. The kill shot was a surgical, asymmetrical tension adjustment across the primary cables, physically changing the bridge's natural heartbeat, exactly like cranking the tuning pegs on a heavy bass guitar to drop the pitch. He stated that a hyper-specific 2% torque adjustment, executed in a mathematically flawless sequence across the grid, would violently shift the bridge's natural frequency completely outside the wind's kill zone. It would instantly assassinate the harmonic resonance without adding a single ounce of dead weight, without delaying the timeline by a single hour, and for a fraction of the cost of the European dampers. The veteran engineer furiously wrote down every word, aggressively translating the raw physics into executable field commands. The billionaires leaned in, hanging on every single stuttered syllable, intensely focused on the man who was casually saving them tens of millions of dollars with a cheap blue marker. Dr. Renata was hovering on the extreme perimeter of the room, her face a chaotic, desperate mask of someone frantically trying to calculate a survival strategy. She took a hesitant step toward the center table, opening her mouth, desperately trying to inject some corporate buzzwords to hijack the narrative and reposition herself as a collaborator rather than the tyrant who almost sank the project. The lead billionaire cut her off before she took a second step. He didn't yell. He executed her with the sub-zero, terrifying brevity of a shark who knows that entertaining a liability is burning cash. Your presence is no longer required in this facility. He let the lethal silence hang for a split second, twisting the knife. Mr. Mendez is officially stepping in as the senior structural consultant for the duration of this build. He locked eyes with her, his face a total dead-eyed void. As for you, I strongly suggest you clear your desk. We are funding elite competence, not toxic arrogance. They are absolutely not the same thing. The boardroom flatlined into the heavy, suffocating silence of an execution that is permanent, public, and totally unappealable. Dr. Renata was escorted off the billion-dollar job site carrying a cheap cardboard box. The ruthless, efficient corporate machine had handed her the box with zero emotion. The pathetic cardboard coffin holding her Ivy League diplomas, her shiny executive desk toys, and the shattered remnants of her ego. She walked out the exact same service gates she had arrogantly ignored for months, permanently exiled from the empire she thought she ruled. Back in the war room, John was surrounded by the engineering team, receiving the heavy, quiet handshakes of men who had just witnessed a masterclass. It wasn't fake corporate networking. It was the raw, unadulterated respect of professionals acknowledging a genius they had blindly ignored, offering a late apology in the only currency that matters in the trenches. Now I'm asking you, and I want a brutally honest answer. If you were sitting in that billionaire's leather chair, would you have pulled the trigger and publicly executed the arrogant engineer in front of the entire board? Or would you have played it safe, given her a second chance, and assumed the humiliation was a harsh enough lesson? There is no right answer, but I want to know exactly how you would handle the fallout. Drop your verdict in the comments. The following months were a masterclass in raw physics violently correcting a crisis. The aggressive, asymmetrical tension adjustments were executed over 3 grueling days, matching John's tactical schematic down to the millimeter. John was on the scaffolding for every single torque setting, wearing a pristine, high-vis foreman's jacket with his name stitched over the heart. He hadn't demanded the jacket to flex on the crew. He wore it with the heavy, quiet dignity of a man who finally had the armor that matched his rank. The lethal vibrations completely died. It wasn't a slow fade. The harmonic screaming was instantly assassinated. It was the terrifying, beautiful silence of a massive structure finally finding its perfect equilibrium. The heavy, satisfying peace of a monster that has been tamed. In his new glass-walled executive office, there was a massive drafting table flanked by 2 4K monitors and a pristine whiteboard bolted to the wall. Dead center on that board, written in faded blue marker, was a single equation anchoring a specific number that had been undeniably true since day one: 0.47 Hertz. Pinned to the whiteboard right next to the math was a faded photograph of an older, grizzled man standing in the mud on a job site, radiating the absolute, unshakable peace of a master in his element. He had the exact same intense laser-guided eyes as John. The eyes of a man who doesn't give a damn about shiny titles, but looks straight through the noise to find the brutal, undeniable truth. The bridge was officially christened months later, with the massive, chaotic circus that always accompanies billion-dollar infrastructure. The politicians, the flashbulbs, the arrogant speeches, the giant scissors cutting the ribbon. There was a massive bronze plaque bolted to the primary tower, and forged into the heavy metal, right near the top where it demanded absolute respect, was the name of the senior technical consultant who saved the structure. John wasn't standing on the podium with the politicians. He was hundreds of feet in the air, standing on the apex of the primary tower. He had insisted on running the final high-altitude stress checks himself, because his old man had taught him that the war is only over when the last bolt is checked, not when the suits start popping champagne. He stood perfectly still on the steel grating, the valley crosswinds howling around him from the exact same vector they always did. He reached out his scarred, calloused hand and pressed his palm flat against the massive primary suspension cable, the exact same way he had done months ago in the dark. The heavy steel was dead quiet, solid as rock. He smiled, a quiet, massive smile that didn't need a single camera to validate it. This brutal story aggressively proves that raw genius doesn't care what kind of uniform you wear, and your actual, undeniable value has absolutely nothing to do with the shiny title on your badge, the Ivy League diploma on your wall, or how smoothly you can talk your way out of a corner. True power is forged in the grueling depth of your knowledge and the ironclad spine you show when you execute it, even when the arrogant cowards around you are too blind to see the truth. The silence of a ghost in the trenches is infinitely more lethal than the screaming arrogance of a fraud in a boardroom. And absolute, undeniable brilliance will always, eventually, find the whiteboard where it belongs. If you believe that raw, humble expertise will always nuke arrogant entitlement, and you love stories that remind us exactly who we need to be when the universe tests our spine, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the next bloodbath of justice. We'll see you in the trenches.